The autumn fog came down early that Thursday morning in Clarksville, Tennessee, the kind of thick, low-hanging gray that softened the edges of everything and made the wealthy neighborhoods on the north side of town look like paintings that had not quite dried. It rolled in off the Cumberland River and settled between the manicured hedgerows and the broad-shouldered oaks lining Ridgeline Drive, muffling sound, softening footsteps, making the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. Cole Armstrong walked to school. He always walked. Not because it was close. It was a mile and a half from the old two-story on Mercer Lane to the front gates of Ridgeline Academy. But because his father's truck was always buried under motorcycle parts by 7 in the morning, and because Cole had never once heard his father suggest otherwise. Walking was fine. Walking was what you did when you had legs and a direction. That was the Armstrong philosophy. He was 10 years old, small for his grade, but dense in the way that kids who do physical things tend to be, all compact muscle and restless energy. His backpack was a faded olive green, one of the shoulder straps held together by a strip of electrical tape that his father had applied with the same careful precision he used on wiring harnesses. His sneakers were clean but scuffed at the toes, and over his school clothes he wore a denim jacket that was at least 2 sizes too large for him, the kind of jacket that had been washed 100 times and had gone soft as flannel, the color of a summer sky that had been through every season. On the back, nearly invisible now from years of fading, was the ghost of an embroidered eagle. It had been his father's. Cole wore it every single day. The road from Mercer Lane curved up a gentle hill and deposited him at the intersection of Ridgeline and Ashwood, where the neighborhood changed the way neighborhoods in that part of Tennessee sometimes did, suddenly, decisively, without apology. On one side of the intersection were the older houses with chain-link side gates and trucks in the driveways and plastic lawn chairs on the porches. On the other side was the World Ridgeline Academy, occupied 4-car garages, pressure-washed concrete sprinkler systems that ran even when it rained. Cole crossed the intersection and kept walking. He passed a Tesla charging in a driveway. He passed a woman in athletic gear loading 2 identically dressed children into a white SUV the size of a small apartment. She did not look at him. He did not expect her to. He pulled the lapels of the denim jacket tighter against the morning chill and kept his eyes forward, one hand resting on the strap of his backpack, the other tucked into his jacket pocket, where his fingers found and turned over the thing he had been carrying since Tuesday. A Polaroid photograph, his father standing in front of the garage at night, lit by the bare fluorescent tube overhead, holding a socket wrench in one hand, with the casual authority of a man holding something that was simply an extension of himself. He was big, genuinely structurally big, not the soft bigness of comfort, but the kind built by work, by years of physical effort and resistance. His arms were covered in ink from wrist to shoulder, dense and dark, a language Cole had spent his entire life learning to read in pieces. He wore a white undershirt and heavy canvas work pants, and over it all the leather cut that Cole had seen every single day of his life. The Iron Wolves patch was on the back. The chapter rocker below it read Tennessee. Cole's thumb moved across the surface of the photograph, feeling the faint chemical texture of the Polaroid film. He had taken it himself 3 weeks ago with the old camera he had found in his father's closet, the one his mother had bought the summer before she died. He kept the photograph in the front pocket of his backpack during school and moved it to his jacket pocket on the walk there and back. He was not sure why. It just felt right to have it close. Ridgeline Academy came into view around the last bend of Ashwood Lane, its front facade, a clean expanse of red brick and tall glass windows, the kind of architecture designed to communicate permanence and prosperity. The American flag flew from a flagpole near the circular drive, and the lawn on either side of the main path was trimmed with geometric precision. Cars were already pulling in along the drop-off lane. Expensive cars. Cole watched a Mercedes stop and discharge a boy named Fletcher, who walked into school like he was arriving somewhere he owned, which in certain practical senses he probably did. His father had donated the new library wing 2 years ago, and his name was on a brass plate by the door. Cole turned off the sidewalk and walked through the front gate. The morning was ordinary in the particular way that days are ordinary right before they stop being ordinary. Cole went to homeroom, turned in a math worksheet, listened to morning announcements. He ate his lunch at the far end of the long table near the windows. Not in exile exactly, but not in the middle of things either. He sat where he had always sat, which was wherever there was a gap between the cliques and the friend groups. In the complex social architecture of fifth grade that age, when children have just barely mastered the art of cruelty and are deploying it constantly, testing its range and reach. He ate a sandwich his father had made that morning, thick bread with good mustard, and he watched the cafeteria. He was good at watching. His father had told him once that the most important skill a man could have was knowing how to read a room, knowing who was settled and who was wound up and where the tension was gathering before it broke. Cole had spent his whole life watching his father do it in the garage. When new customers came in at the club meetings, he had sometimes sat in on as a small child at the gas stations and diners they stopped at on long Sunday rides when the whole chapter was out. He knew how to read a room, and the room he was reading right now told him that Friday was going to be a problem. Career Week had been announced the previous Friday. Each student was to prepare a short presentation about a parent's profession, complete with visual aids, and deliver it to the class. Thursday had gone fine for Cole. He had watched from his seat as a rotating parade of extremely confident 10-year-olds described their parents' lives in the professional class. Charlotte Mead's mother was an OBGYN. Fletcher's father was an architect. A boy named Preston stood up and explained with a laminated trifold board and a printed list of credentials that his father was a federal judge. Cole's name had been called near the end of the Thursday session, and Mrs. Gallagher had looked at him with that careful, slightly pained expression she sometimes wore when dealing with him, not unkind exactly, but cautious, and told him she had moved him to Friday's first slot. He had nodded and said okay and spent all of Thursday night trying to figure out what to say. The problem was not that he did not know what his father did. The problem was that he knew it exactly, understood every dimension of it, could describe in detail the mechanics of the work and the meaning of the life. And he was standing in a school where not one single person would understand any of it. Silas Armstrong, called Iron by everyone who wore the same patch, was the sergeant-at-arms of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Tennessee chapter. He was 44 years old and had been riding since he was 17, had joined the Iron Wolves at 23, had earned his patch through years of loyalty and work that Cole did not fully understand yet, but respected in the way you respect things, whose depth you can sense before you can measure. He ran an automotive restoration shop out of the garage behind their house on Mercer Lane, legitimate work-skilled work that required a knowledge of engines and materials and history that most people who paid for the service had no idea was involved. He also coordinated security for the club, which meant he was the one who stood between his brothers and whatever was threatening them. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was also, Cole knew with the clear-eyed certainty of a child who had been paying close attention his whole life, a man who was absolutely going to make Friday complicated. Not because his father was embarrassing. Cole was not embarrassed by his father. He was proud of his father in the complicated, total way that children are proud of parents who are fully themselves. People who have not bent themselves into shapes they are not, who live out loud and make no apologies for the space they take up. Silas Armstrong filled every room he entered, not through aggression, but through a quality of presence that Cole did not have words for, yet a gravitational heaviness that made people instinctively aware of where he was. The problem was that none of that would translate on Friday. None of it would survive contact with a room full of 10-year-olds who had been taught that worth was visible and measurable and denominated in things you could price. Cole knew this because he had been watching that room for 2 years. He finished his lunch and went back to class. Friday arrived the way bad days sometimes do, sharp and bright, the fog entirely gone the sky over Clarksville, a hard, brilliant blue that made everything look more exposed than usual. Cole was at his desk before the bell. His backpack was open at his feet, and the Polaroid was in his hand under the desk, his thumb moving across its surface again, that nervous, repetitive gesture he had developed sometime in the last 48 hours. Mrs. Ruby Gallagher had the precise, organized energy of someone who had spent 20 years working very hard to avoid conflict. She was not a mean woman. She was not even an unfair woman exactly. She was a woman who had learned to operate within a particular ecosystem and had grown into its shape the way a tree grows around a fence. The ecosystem of Ridgeline Academy was one in which certain parents had tremendous influence, in which the Daltons and the Flynns and the Mercer Coopers sat on the school board and funded the programs, and in which the primary professional goal of teachers who wanted to continue working there was to make those parents feel confirmed in their choices. Cole was not the child of one of those parents. This had never been stated explicitly. It did not need to be. The Friday presentations began. A girl named Harper went first and gave a polished, well-rehearsed speech about her mother, who was an environmental attorney working on water rights cases in 3 states. She had made a poster. The class responded with the kind of engaged adult-style appreciation that children in schools like this had been trained to perform. Then Chase Dalton stood up. Chase was the kind of boy who had learned very early that his father's position in the world was transferable, that the confidence and contempt Gregory Dalton brought into boardrooms and courtrooms could be worn by his son in classrooms and hallways. He was not stupid, he was actually quite sharp, but he had deployed his intelligence almost entirely in the direction of social dominance, and at Ridgeline Academy, he was extraordinarily good at it. He had a presentation board, he had printed photographs, he had a short video on his tablet that he played on the classroom projector. 30 seconds of his father walking into a glass-walled conference room in downtown Nashville, shaking hands with men in suits, turning to the camera with a smile that said everything he needed it to say. Gregory Dalton, Chase explained, was a corporate litigator. He protected the interests of major companies during legal disputes. He had won cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had been named to the Tennessee Super Lawyers list 4 consecutive years. He coached Chase's travel soccer team, and his firm had 14 partners. My dad, Chase said, looking at the class with the comfortable authority of someone who had never once doubted his welcome in a room, says that in the real world, the people who protect money are the people who run the world. That's what he does. He runs things. The class applauded. Mrs. Gallagher said, "Excellent, Chase," in a voice that contained a warmth it did not quite manage for every student equally. Chase sat down and caught Cole's eye on the way back to his seat. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The look communicated everything. "You are next, and I am going to enjoy this." "Cole," Mrs. Gallagher said, "you're up." Cole stood. He walked to the front of the room. He was aware of the specific quality of the silence, the way 23 pairs of eyes arranged themselves differently for him than they had for Harper or Chase. Something between impatience and curiosity, the social predator's alertness to weakness, to anything that diverged from the pattern. He turned and faced the class. He had no poster. He had no tablet. He had no video. He had the Polaroid in his hand, the surface worn smooth from 2 days of nervous handling, and he held it up so the class could see the blurred shape of a large man standing in a lit garage. "My dad's name is Silas," Cole said. His voice was steady. He had decided somewhere in the night that he would not be quiet about this. "He builds and restores motorcycles. He's been doing it since before I was born. He runs his own shop, and he's a member of a motorcycle club called the Iron Wolves." He was watching the room. He saw the shift happen. The moment the word registered, the way motorcycle club moved through the class like a current, the little electrification of attention that comes when something does not fit. Chase tilted his head. His eyes were already doing what they did, that bright, acquisitive calculation. "A motorcycle club," Chase said, not raising his hand, simply speaking into the room with the ease of someone who had never had a teacher stop them for doing exactly this. "Like a gang." "It's not a gang," Cole said. He kept his voice even. "It's a brotherhood." "A brotherhood." Chase repeated the word in a tone that turned it into something slightly ridiculous, something to be examined and found lacking. He looked at the kids on either side of him and let one corner of his mouth rise. "What do they do, your brotherhood, hang out in parking lots?" A few kids laughed, the quick automatic laughter of children who had learned that laughing with Chase was safer than not. "They ride," Cole said. "They build bikes. They look out for each other." "Look out for each other," Chase said, and now he was upstanding, moving into the center of his own performance. "That's what gangs say. My dad says motorcycle clubs are just gangs that wear matching jackets. He says the only people who join them are people who couldn't make it anywhere else." "Your dad has never met my dad," Cole said. The class went still. Not the theatrical stillness of entertainment, but the genuine stillness of surprise. The room recalibrating, 2 dynamics in collision, the expected outcome suddenly uncertain. Chase blinked. He had not expected pushback. Not from Cole Armstrong, who sat in the second row and ate lunch alone and wore a jacket from some other decade. Cole had never pushed back before. "He doesn't need to meet him," Chase said, and there was an edge in his voice now. Something sharper, something that wanted to find the softness and press into it. "A biker is a biker. My dad says they block traffic on weekends, and think they're tough because they wear leather. It's embarrassing. He looked directly at Cole. No offense, but it's embarrassing that you think it's something to be proud of. Something happened in Cole's chest then, a hot climbing pressure that began in his sternum and moved upward. He held the Polaroid out toward the class, turning it so the image was visible. "This is my dad," he'd said. His voice was not entirely steady now. "He's not embarrassing." Chase looked at the photograph from across the room, squinting with theatrical contempt. "Is that his club jacket? Does it have a cool nickname on it?" He turned to the class. "What do you think the nickname is for a biker, Dad? Maybe something like Big Disappointment." The laughter this time was louder, fuller. It spread around the room with the speed of things that had been waiting for permission. Boys and girls, both the particular cruelty of group laughter that targets a specific person, that communicates, "You are outside, you are less than you are here for our entertainment." Mrs. Gallagher said, "All right, that's enough." But she said it in the tone of someone managing volume rather than addressing cause. Cole stood at the front of the room with the Polaroid in his hand and the laughter washing over him, and something inside him locked up the way engines lock up when the oil runs out. A seizing of the mechanism, everything that had been moving suddenly stopped. He felt the heat in his face, the specific anatomy of humiliation, the way it was different from ordinary embarrassment, the way it had a permanence to it that ordinary embarrassment did not. He walked back to his seat. He sat down and stared at the surface of his desk and put the Polaroid in his pocket and kept his hand over it, pressed flat against his leg, as if he could shield the photograph from whatever had just happened. Mrs. Gallagher moved on. The presentations continued. Cole heard none of them. At dismissal, he walked out the side door instead of the main entrance, took the long way to the sidewalk, and headed home at a pace that was not quite running, but covered ground quickly. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dry. He was not going to cry on Ashwood Lane in front of the Range Rovers and the charging Teslas. He was absolutely not going to do that. But the pressure behind them was enormous, an internal weather system building to something. He turned onto Mercer Lane. He could hear the garage before he could see it. The sound of a belt sander, rhythmic and constant, the working sound of his father's mornings. Through the chain-link gate, he could see the garage doors open, the interior lit by the fluorescent overhead, and through the wash of white light, the dark shape of his father bent over a tank, clamped in the vise, the sander moving in long, careful strokes. Cole went through the side door of the house. He did not go to the garage. He went upstairs, closed his bedroom door, lay face down on the bed, and finally, in private, let the pressure behind his eyes release. He cried for a while, not loud, not theatrical, the quiet, sustained crying of someone letting something drain out. He cried because of the laughter which had been directed at him, but had also been directed at his father, at the leather cut, and the motorcycle and the life his father had built, and this felt like the worst thing. Worse than the personal embarrassment, the laughter aimed at the man who had made his lunch that morning and fixed the strap on his backpack and ruffled his hair before sending him out the door. He did not hear his father's footsteps on the stairs until they were already there. Heavy and slow on the old wood, the particular weight pattern he had been hearing his entire life. A knock on the door, not loud, patient. "Cole." A pause. "Cole, I know you're in there. Talk to me." Cole did not answer. He heard the door open anyway. His father had never needed an answer to know when something was wrong. And then the creak of the mattress as 230 pounds settled onto the edge of the bed with the deliberate care of a man who knows he is dealing with something fragile. A hand came down on Cole's back, heavy, warm, calloused on the palm from years of work. Just resting there. "What happened?" Sawa said. Not a question exactly, a declaration that the information was going to come out, that whatever was in there was going to be said out loud. Cole turned over. His face was red and streaked, and he looked at his father's face, which was doing what it always did when Cole was hurting. The outer layer going very still, the jaw setting, the eyes going dark and inward, in a way that was not anger directed at Cole, but at whatever had hurt him. "Career day," Cole said. His voice was rough. "I told them about you. I showed them the picture." He pulled the Polaroid out of his pocket. "Chase Dalton said you were just a guy in a leather jacket who blocks traffic on weekends. He said bikers are people who couldn't make it anywhere else. He said it was embarrassing, that I should be embarrassed." And everyone laughed. The whole class. Mrs. Gallagher didn't even stop it. She just said to settle down and moved on. The silence that followed was the particular silence his father made when he was keeping something controlled. Cole had watched this process his entire life. He knew the difference between the silence of suppression and the silence of calculation. This was the second kind. Silas held out his hand and Cole put the Polaroid in it. His father looked at the photograph for a moment. Himself in the garage socket, wrench fluorescent light, the cut that meant everything, and then set it on the nightstand. You showed them the picture, Silas said. Yeah. And this kid, Chase Dalton. His dad's a lawyer, corporate. He had a whole presentation, video and everything. Silas nodded slowly. His jaw moved a small muscular adjustment, resetting. He said bikers are people who couldn't make it anywhere else. Yeah. Silas stood up from the bed. He stood very still for a moment, which Cole recognized as a moment of decision. Then he said in a voice that had gone very quiet and very level, "You did nothing wrong, Cole. You hear me. You stood up and told the truth about your family. You have nothing to apologize for." I know, Cole said, but it didn't matter. They still laughed. They laughed because they don't know anything. Silas picked up the Polaroid and held it out. Cole took it. Put that back in your pocket. That's a good photograph. Cole put it in his pocket. His father walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back. The overhead light of the hallway was behind him, putting his face in shadow, just the outline of him. The broad shoulders, the forearms, where the ink disappeared under the rolled cuffs of his work shirt. "I'm going to make a few phone calls," Silas said. "Go wash your face. Dinner's in an hour." Cole went to the bathroom and ran cold water over his face and looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. The red around his eyes, the splotches on his cheeks, and then dried off and went down to the kitchen, where the smell of something on the stove was already beginning to fill the house. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to his father's voice through the wall. The calls were short, 4 or 5 of them, each one maybe 3 minutes. Cole could not hear words, just the rhythm and register of his father's voice. Clipped, calm, matter of fact. The voice his father used for logistics, for planning for the organizational communications of the club that Cole had grown up understanding, were a kind of work, serious work, requiring the same precision as a carburetor, rebuild, or a wiring harness just applied to human coordination rather than mechanical systems. He heard his father say open house in Friday afternoon, and then the call stopped. Silas came back to the kitchen and checked the pot on the stove and stirred it and turned the burner down. He got 2 bowls from the cabinet and set them on the counter. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said without turning around, "the school has that parent open house. 3 o'clock. "Yeah," Cole said. "I'll be there." Cole watched his father's back. "Dad." "I know," Silas said. He turned around and looked at his son, and his expression was the one that Cole sometimes saw when his father was about to say something he had thought about carefully. "I know what you're worried about, that it'll be worse, that me showing up will give them more to laugh about." Cole did not answer, which was an answer. "That's not going to happen," Silas said, "but I need you to trust me." Cole looked at his father, the ink, the leather cut hanging on the peg by the back door, the heavy boots by the mat, the socket wrench still tucked in the back pocket of his canvas work pants, and thought about what trust looked like when it was tested, when the world you were trusting a person to navigate was one they had never been in. Then he thought about all the other times his father had said those words, and what had come of it. "Okay," Cole said. Silas nodded and got the ladle and filled both bowls. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table, talking about other things. The 1967 Sportster his father was 2 weeks away from finishing. A crow that had been getting into the neighbor's trash. The math test Cole had aced on Tuesday. The ordinary, easy talk of 2 people who know each other completely, who have never needed anything special to fill the silence between them. After dinner, Cole helped wash the bowls and then went upstairs. He sat on the edge of his bed and took the Polaroid out of his jacket pocket and set it on the nightstand next to his lamp, where the light fell on it and he could see his father clearly. The bigness of him, the steadiness, the absolute quality of presence that the photograph had captured without quite capturing the way photographs never quite got what was actually there. He heard the garage doors roll open below. He heard the Harley turn over the specific idle of the Dyna, a sound so familiar it was part of his internal architecture, as basic as the sound of his own breathing. Then he heard more engines. The phones must have traveled fast. He went to his window and looked down through the dark to the garage and saw in the amber wash of the open garage door his father's bike at the center of a growing collection. 2 more, 3, a 4th pulling in off the alley headlight, cutting through the dark. Dutch. He knew the sound of that road glide, the slightly deeper note of the modified pipes. Cole watched for a while, the engines idling and then falling quiet one by one, the low voices of men who did not need volume to communicate, and felt something in his chest that was not exactly resolved but was different from what had been there before. Not better, not reassured, different. He lay down on his bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the gathering below and eventually fell asleep. The garage was a world. Cole had understood this from the time he was old enough to understand anything, from the years when he was small enough to sit on an upturned milk crate beside the workbench and watch his father's hands move over an engine with the practiced certainty of someone who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. The garage was not just the building behind the house on Mercer Lane, not just the space bounded by the corrugated metal walls and the concrete floor with its oil stains ground in so deep they were geological. It was the center of something, the fixed point around which a great deal of Cole's world organized itself. There were always bikes, not just Silas's own machines. The Dina, that was his primary road bike, the work-in-progress Sportster, the 1972 Shovelhead, he had been restoring for 3 years with the patience of someone who understood that the best things took the time they needed. But customer bikes too. Machines brought in by people who had heard that Silas Armstrong knew what he was doing, that his work was honest and his prices were fair, and that he would not rush something just to collect a payment. The bikes in for work occupied the north end of the garage in various states of assembly or disassembly, each one tagged with a piece of masking tape with the owner's name in his father's careful handwriting, each one treated with the same consideration. Every one of these is somebody's best thing, his father had told him once, years ago, when Cole was maybe 7 and had been sitting on the milk crate watching him rebuild a carburetor that belonged to a man named Ellis, who lived 40 minutes east in a town even smaller than Clarksville. Some of these guys, this is the most valuable thing they own. It means more to them than a car means to a regular person. So you treat it right. You do the work right. Cole had thought about that a lot over the years. The idea of treating something right because it mattered to someone, not because anyone was watching, not because you would get credit for it, just because it was true. The Iron Wolves Club meetings happened on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month at the clubhouse on Industrial Boulevard, a low concrete building that Silas and 3 other members had purchased together 12 years ago and renovated over the course of a summer, the 4 of them working evenings and weekends with the methodical dedication that serious men bring to things that matter. Cole had been to the meetings when he was very small, before he had started school, sitting in a corner with a coloring book, while the adult business of the club went on around him. He remembered the voices overlapping, the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke, the sound of laughter that was different from polite laughter. Rougher, more genuine, the laughter of people who had known each other long enough to find the same things funny. He remembered Terrell Slater, who everyone called Dutch, picking him up when he was 4 or 5 and holding him on one massive forearm so Cole could look out the high window at the parking lot full of bikes, all that chrome and dark metal gleaming under the industrial lights. Dutch was enormous, genuinely enormous, not just big, but built in a way that suggested structural reinforcement shoulders that seemed to have been engineered for load-bearing. He had a scar along his jaw that Cole had asked about once years later. Dutch had said in a voice so matter-of-fact, it made the thing more terrible somehow. Fallujah, second deployment, not worth talking about. Then he had changed the subject to the engine they were looking at, and Cole had understood that there were things men like Dutch did not narrate, did not make into stories, because the narrative framework of stories implied something that had a beginning and a middle and an end, and some things did not end. They just became part of the architecture of the person who had been through them. Dutch's hands shook sometimes. Not badly, not constantly, but Cole had noticed it over the years. A slight fine tremor that his father said was from nerve damage, a souvenir from an IED outside Fallujah that had cost Dutch 6 months of his life and a portion of his hearing in his left ear. The VA had taken another 18 months to get the paperwork straight, during which time Dutch had been living on disability payments that were not enough and trying to navigate a system that seemed designed to exhaust the people who needed it most. He had been living in a rooming house on the south side of Nashville when Silas had found him 3 years after he had come back, at a point that Dutch later described only as the low point. The club had gotten him out, not immediately, not cleanly, not without difficulty, but they had not left him there. Cole had grown up knowing this story in pieces, not as a narrative his father had told him, but assembled from fragments overheard across years. He knew that Dutch now lived in a house that had a proper ramp built by the club members over the course of 3 days, 3 years ago, framing and concrete and handrails. A project that had required no formal coordination because when Silas had said the work needed doing, 11 men had shown up at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, and it had gotten done. He knew that Dutch had 2 dogs and a vegetable garden, and that he came to every club meeting and rode his road glide when the weather was good. This was not embarrassing. This was not a hobby. Cole lay on his bed and thought about Chase Dalton saying it was embarrassing and felt the particular sharpness of that word again. He tried to hold the two things at once. What he knew about his father and his father's brothers, the actual truth of it, in the way that truth had been received in Mrs. Gallagher's fifth-grade classroom, and found that they would not quite coexist, that the distance between them was too vast to be bridged by anything as simple as an explanation. You could not explain Terrell Slater in 2 minutes with a Polaroid photograph. You could not explain Knox Pierce, who owned the fabrication plant on Route 9 and employed 83 people, many of whom had been unemployed for years before Knox had started hiring, building a business out of stubbornness and technical knowledge and the willingness to bet on people that no one else was betting on. You could not explain Axel Riggs, who ran the shop downtown, who Cole had visited once when he was 8 and had watched work a magic that had nothing to do with engines, standing in a shop full of teenagers who had reasons to be angry at everything, explaining with patient technical precision why a particular socket wrench was the right tool for a particular fastener, and watching something happen in those kids' faces, some door opening onto the possibility that their hands could make things work. You could not explain any of it in the time allotted by Career Week at Ridgeline Academy, but Cole suspected his father was going to try anyway. The Thursday night before the open house had begun quietly in the garage on Mercer Lane and become something else by 9 o'clock. By then, Cole had been in bed, or had appeared to be lying with his eyes closed while his mind tracked the sounds from below with the involuntary attentiveness of someone too wired to fully surrender to sleep. He heard the gates open and close, the careful, specific sounds of motorcycles navigating the side lot, without waking the neighborhood engines cut before the lot pushed by hand through the gate. He heard his father's voice, quiet and even, directing where bikes should park. He heard other voices, Dutch's deep, unhurried bass, the faster, more angular speech patterns that were Axel's Knox's deliberate dry delivery. By 8:30, there were 7 bikes in the lot. By 9:11. Cole had gotten up once, moving to his window to look out, and had seen the garage lit up below his father and Dutch and several other men he recognized from years of Saturday gatherings standing around the Dinah in the center bay. Silas was talking and using his hands in the particular way he did when he was laying out the logistics of something, not gesturing expressively, but pointing and measuring, indicating distances and positions with the functional precision of a man who had organized things that required precision. What Cole had not known, lying there listening, was the conversation that had begun about 40 minutes earlier when Dutch had arrived first and knocked on the back door and stood on the back step when Silas opened it and said simply, "I heard." Silas had looked at him. Word travels. Axel texted me 30 seconds after you called him. Dutch shrugged one of his massive shoulders. "The kid's doing all right." "He'll be fine," Silas said. "Come in." Dutch had sat at the kitchen table while Silas poured coffee, and for a few minutes they had just been there. 2 men in their 40s in a kitchen that still had a child's drawing tacked to the refrigerator with a magnet, a drawing Cole had done in first grade, of what was clearly a motorcycle rendered in orange crayon, the proportions creative rather than accurate. "I remember the first time they got me," Dutch said. He was looking at the drawing. "First day I tried to go back to school, GI Bill Nashville Community Fall of 2007. Walked into a poli-sci class and sat down, and the professor spent 20 minutes on an anti-military rant clearly aimed at the 3 of us, who were visibly vets in that room." He turned the coffee cup. "Didn't say anything, just packed up my stuff and walked out." He looked at Silas. "Cole's 10. He didn't walk out." "No," Silas said. "He stayed and took it." "That's harder," Dutch said. Silas looked at the first grade drawing on the refrigerator, the orange motorcycle, the approximate wheels. "He came home and went straight to his room. That's when I knew." Dutch nodded. He understood what it meant when a man who had been given a reason to be ashamed did not come to you immediately. Shame turned inward. Shame went to the bedroom and closed the door. "He's going to be all right," Dutch said. "That kid has your bones." Silas had not said anything to that. He had refilled Dutch's coffee, and they had sat in the kitchen for a while longer, and then the first of the other bikes had turned onto Mercer, and the evening had moved into the garage and become what it became. The plan had been simple. Silas had not drafted a speech. He had not prepared talking points or rehearsed a strategy. The only plan was presence. To arrive in number, to stand where Cole stood, to make visible what the patch meant to people who had decided they knew what it meant without ever having looked at it directly. Dutch had offered to speak if it came to that. "It'll come to that," Axel had said from where he was sitting on an overturned bucket near the south wall, cleaning the chrome on his handlebars with a rag. "Trust me, there's going to be a guy in a suit." "There's always a guy in a suit," Knox had agreed. "Gregory Dalton," Silas had said, and several of the men had looked up. "Corporate litigator. His kid is the one who ran the show in class yesterday. You might recognize the name. He was on the school board committee that tried to block the vocational training program at Jefferson Davis Middle School last spring." There had been a silence. "That guy," Axel said. "That guy," Silas confirmed. Knox had leaned against the wall and looked at the floor for a moment. "He's going to threaten to call the police." "Let him call them," Dutch said. "We're not doing anything illegal." "The optics are what matter," Knox said, "not the legality." "The optics," Silas said, "are exactly what we want them to be." He had looked around the garage at the men present, with more still coming, and his expression had been the one Cole would have recognized from years of watching his father say things that contained the full weight of what he actually believed. "We're not there to threaten anyone. We're not there to intimidate. We're there because Cole stood up and told the truth about his family and got laughed at for it. We're there because that's what we do when one of ours gets hurt. We show up, that's all." The men had been quiet for a moment. Then Dutch had raised his coffee cup, and the others had found whatever they were holding, and they had held them up briefly in the silent, untheatrical acknowledgement of men who do not need ceremony to mean what they mean. The bikes had continued arriving through the evening. By 10 o'clock, there were 32. The last 6 had arrived early Friday morning, riding in from the eastern part of the state, from chapter members who had heard through their own networks, and had decided with the simple directional certainty of people who understand obligation that this was a thing they were going to be present for. 38 members, all in. That was the count. Cole had not known most of this. He had known the sounds from below and the quality of what those sounds represented, the gathering of something large and purposeful. And he had gone to sleep, and that knowledge arranged inside him like load-bearing structure. Not conscious comfort exactly, but a deeper kind of assurance. The assurance that comes from understanding that certain things in your life are actually solid, that when you press on them, they do not give. His father had built that structure over 10 years. Over 10 years of doing what he had said he would do, of being where he said he would be, of applying to the project of raising his son the same quality of attention and patience and care that he applied to every engine he had ever worked on. Not rushing, not cutting corners, doing the work right because it mattered. A child who has been raised that way does not have to think about trust. It is already in there, part of the architecture. Cole had not been afraid on Friday morning because he knew what his father had built. Friday came back around like it was in a hurry. Cole was up before his alarm dress, before his father knocked on his door downstairs, eating the bowl of oatmeal his father had left on the stove covered with a plate to keep it warm. Silas was already in the garage. Cole could hear the Dyna idling, being checked and checked again, the sound of mechanical attention of a man going over a machine, the way a soldier goes over equipment before an operation. He did not know what was going to happen. He was not sure he wanted to. He washed his bowl, put it in the rack, picked up his backpack. He put the Polaroid in his jacket pocket. He went to the back door and stopped. Through the kitchen window, he could see the garage, his father's silhouette moving through the lit interior, and behind the Dina, in the lot beyond the chain-link gate, 3 other bikes already parked and gleaming in the early morning light. More would come. He did not know how many. His father had made his calls, and whatever was going to happen was already in motion, set in motion by the logic of what his brothers were. People who showed up, people who came when called, people for whom the idea of leaving a member's kid to face something alone was simply incomprehensible. Cole shouldered his backpack. He opened the door. Cole, his father, was standing in the garage entrance, coffee cup in hand, looking at him through the morning light. "You're going to be fine," Silas said. "Whatever happens today in that school, you hold your head up. You got that?" Cole looked at his father, the ink on his forearms, the creases around his eyes. the leather cut on the peg behind him with the Iron Wolves patch visible from across the yard. "Yeah," Cole said, "I got it." He turned and walked down Mercer Lane toward Ridgeline Academy, and the morning was bright and cold, and the sky over Clarksville was a hard, brilliant blue, and somewhere behind him in the garage, an engine turned over and settled into idle patient as geology waiting for 3 o'clock. The school day unfolded around Cole like weather he was walking through without getting wet. He sat in his desk in second period English and stared at the board, while Mrs. Gallagher diagrammed sentences his mind elsewhere, moving through the geometry of the afternoon, imagining the open house and the gymnasium, and the moment when whatever his father had set in motion arrived in that carefully curated world and changed its atmosphere. He was not afraid. He had decided somewhere between waking and the bowl of oatmeal that he was done being afraid of this specific thing. The fear of the day before, the anticipatory dread of exposure of being the wrong kind of different in a room full of people who had decided what the right kind looked like, had burned through itself in the night and left something else behind. He did not have a word for it yet. It was not confidence exactly. It was more like the state of having accepted something you cannot change and finding in the acceptance a peculiar kind of steadiness. At lunch, he sat in his usual spot near the windows and ate his sandwich. Fletcher sat 3 seats down and talked about a college football game. 2 girls from his homeroom discussed a show they were both watching. The ordinary life of the cafeteria moved around Cole like water around a fixed point. Chase Dalton passed his table on the way to the trash can. He did not say anything, but he slowed down just slightly and looked at Cole with that measuring, calculating look, the one that was evaluating threat level, deciding whether yesterday's advantage was still intact. Cole looked back at him and did not look away. Chase moved on. At 1:30, the announcement came over the PA system. Parents were invited to arrive for the Career Week open house at 2:45 in the main gymnasium. Cole watched the clock. He thought about the phone calls he had overheard the night before. He thought about the sound of those engines in the lot arriving one by one, their weight to the gathering. He thought about Terrell Slater driving his modified Road Glide 45 minutes from Nashville because Silas Armstrong's son had been laughed at in a classroom. He thought about Axel Riggs, who had been a kid nobody showed up for, now showing up. He thought about Knox Pierce, who would come anyway because this was what the patch meant. Not a symbol to wear, but a commitment to keep. At 2:15, Cole's classroom began the process of transitioning to the open house. Cole picked up his backpack. He reached into his jacket pocket, and his fingers found the Polaroid. Still there, still warm from being carried. He took a breath and followed his class down the hall toward the gymnasium. The gymnasium at Ridgeline Academy had been built to hold 400 people. For the Career Week open house, it held approximately 230. Parents, siblings, and the 5th grade class itself distributed across folding tables covered in white paper tablecloths where the student projects were displayed. There were refreshments at a long table near the far wall. There was a string quartet positioned near the entrance, playing something appropriate and easily ignorable. The overhead fluorescence gave everything the particular flat illumination of institutions, washing out color and softening shadow in a way that made everyone look slightly more approximate than they actually were. Cole stood at his display space in the far corner. His section of table had a folding card with his name on it and a small corkboard with 2 things, the Polaroid of his father pinned to the center, with a push pin and a short paragraph he had written in his best handwriting on lined notebook paper. The paragraph said, "My father is Silas Armstrong. He is a motorcycle mechanic and restorer. He has been working on engines since he was 17. He is a member of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. His club looks out for its members and for people in the community who need help. He is the best person I know." He had written it the night before after dinner, after the sounds from the garage had finally gone quiet. He was not sure it was enough. He was not sure anything was enough, but he had written it and pinned it up and stood behind the table and watched the gymnasium fill with the particular class of parents who sent their children to Ridgeline Academy. Gregory Dalton arrived at 2:40 already in full performance mode. He was tall and well-maintained in the specific fashion of men who spend money on the things that maintain appearance. His suit a shade of charcoal that probably had a name beyond charcoal. He moved through the gymnasium, greeting other parents with the selective warmth of a man who was always simultaneously socializing and calculating, always aware of who mattered and who did not. Chase had positioned himself at his own display, The full trifold board, the printed photographs, the small screen playing the video on a loop. And when his father arrived, he straightened up with the instinctive attentiveness of a child performing for the parent whose approval means the most. Cole watched this from his corner and looked at his own display, the Polaroid, the notebook paper paragraph, and felt the distance between them with a clarity that was not painful exactly, but was precise. He was not going to compete on those terms. There was no version of this afternoon in which his table looked like Chase's table. He watched the clock above the gymnasium doors. 2:43, 2:44. At 2:45, exactly the sound started. It was low at first, below the threshold of the string quartet, and the conversation and the general ambient noise of a well-attended school event. Cole felt it before he heard it, a vibration that moved through the floor of the gymnasium and up through the soles of his shoes and registered somewhere in his chest as something distinct from the usual sounds of Friday afternoon. It was rhythmic and deep, a fundamental note, the kind of sound that bypasses the intellect and addresses the body directly. Other people felt it too. The string quartet faltered. A woman near the refreshment table paused mid-sentence, turning her head toward the high windows on the gymnasium's east side. The sound grew. It resolved for those who knew what it was into the unmistakable signature of large displacement internal combustion engines. Not one, not three, but many running together with the slightly uneven, syncopated rhythm of machines tuned by different hands, each one its own voice, in a choir that was growing louder by the second. Mrs. Patricia Holloway, the school director, appeared near the main doors with the expression of someone who had not yet identified the problem, but had identified that there was one. Gregory Dalton had moved to the windows. He was standing with two other fathers, all of them craning to see through the high glass, their faces composed in the expressions of men who were trying to determine whether something required their intervention. Cole had not moved from his spot in the corner. He stood behind his table with both hands flat on its surface and watched the main gymnasium doors. His heart was doing something complicated. The vibration in the floor was now audible to everyone in the room, a low mechanical thunder clearly coming from the parking lot. Through the high windows, the first of the headlights swept across the ceiling. Then another, then more. The sound peaked. 38 V-twin engines idling simultaneously in the parking lot of Ridgeline Academy created a collective acoustic presence that penetrated the brick walls and the double-pane windows and occupied the gymnasium with a physical authority that made conversation impossible. The string quartet gave up entirely. Every head in the gymnasium had turned toward the windows or the main doors. Then in the parking lot, visible through the high glass, the engines cut out. One by one, in a sequence that was deliberately staggered, the engines died, each silence adding to the previous one, until the last one went quiet and the parking lot became absolutely still. The ticking of cooling exhaust pipes was audible through the gymnasium walls. Gregory Dalton turned from the window, his face doing something complicated, trying to recalibrate between several possible responses. He settled on authority. "Patricia," he said to the school director, "I think you need to get security." "We have one security guard," Patricia Holloway said with the barely contained honesty of a woman who had never needed to deploy that information before. Then the main gymnasium doors opened. They did not burst open. They were not thrown. They swung open with a slow, deliberate control that was in some ways more imposing than violence would have been. The movement of men who know that presence speaks before words do. Silas Armstrong came through first. He was wearing his work clothes, canvas pants, heavy boots, the leather cut of the Iron Wolves chapter. And he moved the way he always moved, which was the way large, powerful men move when they are entirely certain of their right to occupy the space they are in, without aggression, without performance, simply present in a way that rearranged the room's gravity. Behind him came Terrell Slater, whose size was such that his presence in the gymnasium doorway briefly seemed to reduce the dimensions of the door itself. Behind Dutch came Axel Riggs. Behind Axel came Knox Pierce. And behind Knox, in a stream that took nearly a full minute to complete, came 34 more members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Tennessee chapter, fully patched, in leather and denim, every back bearing the same patch, the wolf's head in profile against a gear, and the Tennessee chapter rocker below it. They moved in, not rushing, not aggressive, simply filling the space the way water fills a container, finding the floor spreading out, occupying the gymnasium with the unhurried certainty of a tide. The parents parted for them with the instinctive physical response of bodies that have assessed a situation and concluded that certain pathways are closed. Silas Armstrong scanned the room. Cole in his corner raised one hand. His father found him with the direct, immediate certainty of a man navigating by a fixed star and began moving through the gymnasium toward his son's corner, and the 38 members of the Iron Wolves moved with him, behind him, a formation that communicated without words, that where Silas Armstrong was going, they were going too. The gymnasium had gone completely silent except for footsteps. Heavy, unhurried, the rhythmic thud of engineer boots on a gymnasium floor echoing up into the rafters. Gregory Dalton stepped into their path. He did it with the body language of a man who believed that his position in the world constituted a portable authority. He planted his feet and put his shoulders back and looked at Silas Armstrong with the expression he used on opposing counsel, controlled, certain, the communicating posture of a man who has decided the outcome before the argument begins. "This is a private school event," Gregory Dalton said. His voice carried, well trained by years of courtroom projection. "You and your club are not welcome here. I want you to turn around and leave immediately. If you don't, I'm calling the police." Silas stopped. He stopped 3 feet from Gregory Dalton and looked at him. The looking was not a glare, was not a threat. It was an assessment. The same quality of attention Cole had seen his father apply to engines that were not running right, a steady diagnostic attention that was entirely focused and entirely without performance. "I'm a parent," Silas said. His voice was not loud. The gymnasium's acoustics carried it perfectly to every corner. "My son is a student here. The open house is for parents. I'm here." "You are causing a disturbance," Gregory Dalton said. "My son caused a disturbance," Silas said, "by standing up in front of your son's class yesterday and being honest about his family." He looked at Gregory Dalton without looking away. "And your son spent 10 minutes making a room full of 10-year-olds laugh at him for it. I'm here to correct a misunderstanding." Gregory's jaw tightened. This kind of intimidation tactic. "I'm not intimidating anyone," Silas said. "These are my brothers. They came because my son was embarrassed in front of his class. In this family, when one of us gets hurt, the rest of us show up. That's what brothers do." He paused. "You might explain that concept to your son." The silence in the gymnasium was total. 200 parents and children and teachers had ceased all movement and stood in a collective holding of breath, watching the two men facing each other. Then Silas turned his back on Gregory Dalton. He turned with a deliberateness that communicated everything a deliberate dismissal can communicate, and walked toward Cole's corner, and the 38 members of the Iron Wolves moved with him. They reached Cole's display. Cole was standing behind the table with his hands on its surface, looking at his father. He had been watching the whole thing, the entrance, the confrontation, and something in him had been shifting the entire time, a realignment of some internal weight. The shame that had been sitting in his chest since the classroom yesterday had not disappeared, but it had changed character. It was no longer the only thing in there. Silas looked at the display, the Polaroid, the notebook paper paragraph. He read the paragraph all the way through, and when he was done, he looked at Cole, and his expression was the one he had in private, the one that was for family only. "You wrote this," he said. "Last night," Cole said. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the Polaroid. Himself, the garage, the fluorescent light, the iron and leather of his life, made visible in a 3-inch photograph. And then he turned to face the gymnasium, and he stood in front of Cole's table, and the 38 men spread out behind him, and the room waited. "My son stood up yesterday," Silas began. His voice was level, neither raised nor diminished, simply present in the room. He stood up in front of his class and told them his father was a biker. He showed them this photograph. He gestured behind him toward the corkboard, and the class laughed. Your children laughed at my son. He let that sit in the air for a moment. "I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because my son believed you'd all benefit from an accurate picture of what the word biker actually means, since we're having career week." He turned to his left. Dutch was standing there, 6'4", 260 pounds, the scar along his jaw, lit by the gymnasium fluorescence, hands hanging at his sides, with the specific stillness of a man who has learned to be still in situations much more intense than this one. "This is Terrell Slater," Silas said. "We call him Dutch. If your kids have questions about his career, Dutch served 2 tours as a Marine combat medic in Fallujah. He pulled men out of burning vehicles on streets you have never heard of in a war you watched on television. He came home with nerve damage and hearing loss in a VA backlog that took 2 years to clear. Last year, 3 members of this club spent a week building a ramp so Dutch could get his wheelchair into his own kitchen." He looked at Gregory Dalton. That's what a club does. That's what brothers do. He looked to his right at Knox Pierce, who was built lean and hard, in the way of men who have spent decades doing physical work. His gray beard neatly trimmed, his leather cut worn, with the comfortable ease of a garment that was simply part of him. Knox Pierce, Silas said, owns Pierce Metalworks on Route 9, 83 employees. Most of them were unemployed when Knox hired them. Some of them had records. Some of them had been told by people in nice suits that they were not hireable. He looked at the parents. Knox hired them because he knew what competence looked like under circumstances that were not comfortable, because he had been in those circumstances himself. He found Axel Riggs. Axel was standing near the back of the group, arms crossed, the tattoos on his neck visible above the collar of his shirt. Not performing, not posturing, just present. Axel Riggs, Silas said, grew up in state care, moved through 11 different placements between the ages of 4 and 18. The system produced him and then forgot him the way it tends to. He paused. Today, he runs a shop on Broad Street in Nashville, teaches basic mechanics to kids the court system has identified as at risk. He has placed 62 of those kids in employment in the last 7 years. He looked at Gregory Dalton. 62 kids who had every reason to end up somewhere worse, who have siege and skills and a reason to stay. The gymnasium had been silent for a long time now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down and holds people in place. Cole watched the parents, watched the faces doing the work of recalibrating, watched the women who had clutched their purses at the entrance, looking at Dutch and Knox and Axel, with expressions that were moving slowly and visibly from alarm towards something else. Silas turned and looked at his son, the full weight of his attention, the directional certainty of a man who has said what needed to be said to the room and is now saying something only to one person. "Cole," he said, "come here." Cole came around the table. His father dropped to one knee on the gymnasium floor, bringing his face level with Cole's, and the 38 men behind him were very still. The room was very still, and Silas Armstrong put both hands on his son's shoulders and looked at him. "You are never going to be ashamed of this family," he said. "Not for them, not for anybody. You got that?" Cole looked at his father's face, at the lines around his eyes, at the ink on his forearms, where his hands gripped Cole's shoulders, at the patch on the leather cut, and the wolf's head in the word Tennessee, and everything that it had taken and meant and cost for that patch to be there. "I got it," Cole said. His father held his gaze for a moment longer, making sure. Then he stood up. He stood up to his full height and looked at the room. "His project," Silas said, and his voice was quiet now, the way voices go quiet when they have found the thing they were actually trying to say, "deserves a fair grade." He stood up yesterday and told you the truth about his family. A kid who tells the truth about hard things deserves credit. That is all I came here to say. He looked at Mrs. Gallagher, who was standing near the far wall, her face pale, her eyes bright with something that was not quite composed. She nodded, rapidly, definitively. "Of course," she said. "Of course, Mr. Armstrong." Silas gave her a single nod. Then he looked at Dutch, and Dutch looked back, and the look between them contained something that had no language. The communication of men who have been through enough together that they have developed a shorthand that goes below words. "All right," Silas said, "let's roll." And just like that, the 38 members of the Iron Wolves turned toward the gymnasium doors, and the gymnasium watched them go, and the only sound was boots on the polished floor, receding toward the exit until they were through the doors and gone. And the gymnasium remained with the absence of their presence, like a room that has had all its furniture rearranged and has not yet figured out how to be itself again. The gymnasium took about 30 seconds to remember how to breathe. It started at the edges, a small murmur near the refreshment table, a low exchange between two mothers near the bleachers, and then it moved inward through the room like a wave returning after a stone had been dropped into still water. Voices came back, gradually tentative, at first finding their register. The string quartet did not resume playing. Patricia Holloway stood near the gymnasium doors, looking at the space where 38 men had been standing 2 minutes ago, and appeared to be genuinely uncertain what the appropriate institutional response was to what had just occurred. Cole stood at his display table. He was aware of being looked at, not in the way he had been looked at in the classroom yesterday, not with the predatory, entertained attention of children who have identified a target, but differently. The wide, uncertain attention of people who were reconsidering something. The parents who looked at him were doing so with an expression he did not have a precise word for, yet something between reassessment and embarrassment. The expression of people who have been shown that the picture they had was not accurate and are now trying to figure out how to hold the revised version. He put his hands back on the table. He looked at the Polaroid, his father in the garage, the fluorescent light, the socket wrench, the cut. He was aware that Chase Dalton had not approached his display. He looked over toward Chase's table and saw Chase standing beside it with his father. Gregory Dalton was not looking at Cole's corner. He was talking to another parent in a blue suit, his voice measured and controlled, using the body language of a man reclaiming his footing, establishing that the ground was still where he had left it. Chase was looking at the floor. Mrs. Gallagher appeared at Cole's table. She had composed herself in the interval since the 38 men had walked out, had done the internal work required to stand upright and come over here and do the things she needed to do. But Cole could see the effort in her face, the slightly over-controlled quality of her expression. "Cole," she said. She cleared her throat. "Your project, your presentation." She paused, seeming to search for the right thing. "The paragraph you wrote about your father is genuinely impressive. The clarity of it, the honesty." She looked at the corkboard, the Polaroid, the notebook paper. "I'm giving it full marks. You earned them." Cole looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Gallagher." She nodded and held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary and then moved away. He turned back to his display and stood there while the open house moved around him. The conversations gradually rebuilding the room, finding its social footing again. Other parents came to look at their children's projects. No one came to Cole's table. He had not expected anyone to. He stood there and looked at the Polaroid and thought about the shape of the afternoon, the arrival, the entrance, the confrontation with Gregory Dalton, his father kneeling on the gymnasium floor with both hands on his shoulders, and felt the weight of it settle, felt it move from the realm of event into the realm of memory. The specific process by which things become permanent, become part of what a person carries. He thought about Dutch building ramps, about Knox hiring people that nobody else would, about Axel standing in a shop with kids who had every reason to stop trying, teaching them to use their hands. He thought about his father saying, "You are never going to be ashamed of this family." He believed it. He had always believed it in the underlying foundational way that children believe things that are shown to them consistently and completely over years. But it had been tested yesterday in that classroom, and the test had been real, and the laughter had been real, and the shame had been real too. Not shame of his father, not shame of the leather cut or the club or the life, but shame of being exposed, of being the wrong kind of different in the wrong room, at the wrong time, of having the thing you loved most turned into a punchline. And his father had known, had understood without being told what the test had actually been, and had responded in the only way that was actually adequate to it. Not a conversation, not reassurance, not an explanation. This, 38 men on motorcycles, driving 45 minutes on a Friday afternoon because a 10-year-old had been embarrassed. Cole put both hands flat on the table and felt the surface cool and solid under his palms and looked at the gymnasium around him, the white tablecloths, the refreshments, the projects, the parents in their expensive clothes, the whole carefully maintained apparatus of a certain kind of success, and felt clearly and without drama that he was not outside of this room, not less than the people in it. He was exactly what he was. A kid from Mercer Lane whose father built engines and kept promises and would drive 38 brothers through Clarksville on a Friday afternoon because that was what brotherhood meant when you tested it against something real. The open house wound down. Parents began collecting children and heading for the parking lot. Mrs. Holloway directed the teardown of the refreshment table with the slightly shell-shocked efficiency of a woman completing her duties in the aftermath of an event she was still processing. Cole folded his corkboard and put it under his arm. He put the Polaroid back in his jacket pocket, the front pocket where it lived. He picked up his backpack and stood up straight. He walked through the gymnasium toward the exit. As he moved through the room, he passed people, parents, teachers, students, and some of them looked at him, and what he saw in their faces was different from what he had seen in faces at this school before. Not pity, not the indulgent awareness of the parent from the wrong side of the intersection. Something more complicated than that. Something that required from him only acknowledgement, not management. He walked through the main doors and out into the parking lot. The afternoon sun was low and hard and orange, the angle of late Tennessee autumn, and it hit the empty spaces in the parking lot where 38 motorcycles had been and were no longer. The lot was quiet now except for the ordinary sounds of school dismissal, Car doors, voices, the institutional rumble of buses pulling around to the front. Chase Dalton was standing near the bus lane with a group of his friends. He had his blazer on properly, now his presentation board under one arm. He was talking to the other boys in the measured, careful way of someone who is performing confidence and working harder at it than usual. When Cole came through the doors, Chase saw him. The group went quiet in the specific way of groups that are watching how two people handle something. Cole looked at Chase. Chase looked back. Between them was the distance of what had happened in the classroom yesterday and what had happened in the gymnasium today, a distance that was not exactly bridged, but was measured now differently than it had been 24 hours ago. The arithmetic of it had changed. Chase looked away first, not dramatically, not with any apparent acknowledgement of what the looking away meant. He simply turned back to the group and resumed talking, and the group resumed its performance of not having noticed anything. Cole walked past them toward the sidewalk. He turned onto Ashwood Lane and then onto the long familiar slope of Ridgeline Drive, heading south toward the intersection heading home, and the afternoon sun was behind him, and the shadowy cast was long on the pavement ahead, stretching out and leading him forward. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, he could hear the low note of a Harley engine coming through the quiet residential streets. He did not speed up. He did not need to. He walked at his usual pace, his backpack on his shoulders, the corkboard under his arm, the Polaroid in his pocket, scuffed sneakers moving steadily on the sidewalk head up, the way his father had told him. The sound of the engine grew until it was close, and then Silas Armstrong came around the corner on the Dyna rolling at low speed and pulled up alongside Cole and idled there, keeping pace with his son's walking speed. He did not say anything right away. He just rode alongside the big engine ticking over the late sun, catching the chrome. Cole looked over at his father. "Mrs. Gallagher gave me full marks," Cole said. His father looked at him from under the brim of his helmet. "Good," he said. They continued in silence for a moment, the Dyna rolling alongside at walking speed. "Dutch says he's making his chili Saturday," Silas said. "You want to ride over?" Cole looked at his father, at the patch on the leather cut, at the ink on the forearms where they rested on the handlebars, at the absolute settled presence of a man who was exactly who he was and had never been anything else. "Yeah," Cole said. "I want to." Silas nodded once. He stayed at walking speed, keeping pace all the way down Ashwood Lane and past the intersection and onto Mercer, riding alongside his son through the fading afternoon, the engine sound filling the quiet street, moving toward home. The Saturday after the open house arrived with the particular quality of a day that knows it is following something significant. Still and bright and unhurried, the kind of Tennessee autumn morning that comes with enough warmth to make you think summer is reconsidering its departure. Cole woke to the sound of the garage already active below the metallic ringing of a wrench on a hard surface. His father's working rhythm unchanged by everything that had happened the day before. This was one of the things Cole understood most deeply about his father, the constancy of him. The world could do what it did, could erupt or reconfigure or present its challenges, and Silas Armstrong would respond to it and then return to the work because the work was always there, because the engines always needed tending, because a man who builds things cannot stop building when things get difficult. This was not avoidance. Cole had watched his father long enough to know the difference between avoidance and the patient, continuous commitment of a man for whom work was not a distraction from life, but the expression of it. He dressed and went downstairs. His father was in the garage with the Sportster, the 1967, that had been the project for the past 2 years, and Cole stood in the doorway for a moment and watched. The careful hands on the primary cover, the angle of the light, the organized arrangement of tools that was one of Silas's working habits. Everything placed where it would be when you needed it. A mug of coffee sat on the workbench. Outside, through the open garage doors, the morning was clear and cold. "Dutch is at 11, his father said without looking up. "I know," Cole said. "You want breakfast first or after?" "Before." Silas set down the wrench and came into the kitchen and made eggs and toast the way he always made them, methodical and without fuss. And they ate at the kitchen table in the same comfortable quiet they had eaten in all week, the ordinary domestic silence of a household with its own rhythms and routines. Cole ate and thought about the week. Not obsessively. He did not have the kind of mind that circled things endlessly, but with the natural processing of a person letting events settle into their permanent place in memory. The classroom, the laughter, the Polaroid in his hand, the walk home, the locked door, his father's hand on his back, the phone calls through the wall, the gathering in the lot, the gymnasium. Chase Dalton's face when he had looked away. "Dad," Cole said. His father looked at him from across the table. "What you said yesterday, about being the richest kid in the room." He turned his fork over on the plate. "I didn't feel that way on Thursday when they were laughing." "I know," Silas said. "I just felt like everything was wrong. Like I was the wrong kind of person in the wrong place." His father was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup, then at Cole. "You know what it takes to feel that way," he said. "You have to care about the room. You have to have something you value being laughed at. If you didn't care about what I do about this family, about what that patch means, it would have just rolled off you." He paused. "The fact that it hurt is the point. It hurt because it was aimed at something real." Cole looked at him. "Real things hurt when they get hit," his father said. "Fake things don't. Chase Dalton and his father are very good at protecting things that don't actually exist. Corporate reputation, image, the way other people see you at events like that." He set down his cup. "I would rather have something real that can be hurt than something fake that cannot." Cole sat with that for a moment. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the neighbor's oak. The kitchen light shifted as a cloud moved over the sun. "She texted me this morning," his father said. "Full marks." Cole blinked. "She has your number. I gave it to her when you enrolled. She hadn't used it before yesterday." His father's expression was dry and contained the expression he used for things that were not entirely without humor. "I imagine she has some thoughts she's processing." Cole almost smiled. "Probably." They finished breakfast. His father washed the plates. Cole got his jacket, the denim jacket, the faded one, the one that had been his father's and had become his, and they went out to the garage. The ride to Dutch's house was 45 minutes east on Route 40 into the rolling country where the farms started appearing, and the towns were smaller, and the horizon opened up into something that felt like space, impossibility, and the kind of distance that puts things in proportion. Silas rode the Dyna, and Cole sat behind him on the back seat with his arms around his father's jacket and the wind against his face and the engine sound beneath them constant and enormous. Cole had ridden since before he could ride anything else. He had no memory of his first time on the back of a motorcycle, which meant it had happened before the formation of stable memory, which meant it was simply always part of what his life contained. He knew how to sit on the back, how to lean with the bike in curves, how to keep his feet on the pegs, how to hold on without tensing against the movement, but going with it, trusting the machine and the man in front of him. He pressed his face against the back of his father's jacket and watched the Tennessee countryside open up on either side of the road, the fall color still hanging in the hills, gold and rust and the deep particular red of sweet gums, and felt the accumulated weight of the week moving through him and then past him, the way the wind moved through and past without sticking. Dutch's house was a single-story ranch on 3 acres east of a town called Hartwell, a property that had been purchased for its accessibility. The driveway was wide and level. The approaches were all graded. The modifications throughout the house were numerous and practical and had been applied with care. The ramp that led to the side entrance was the one Cole knew about, the one built by the club over a weekend 3 years ago. Framing and concrete and handrails painted to match the house trim built as though it had always been there. 2 other bikes were already in the driveway when Silas pulled in. Knox Pierce's Road King and a Softail that Cole recognized as belonging to Weston, one of the chapter's newer members who had been at the gymnasium yesterday, one of the 38 faces in the line. Dutch met them at the door. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, no cut today, his enormous frame filling the doorway in the way it always did. "There he is," Dutch said. He looked at Cole the way Cole was used to being looked at by men who had known him since before he could remember being known. "You look exactly the same as yesterday, which means the world didn't eat you." "It tried," Cole said. Dutch's face did the thing it did when he was genuinely pleased. "Get in here." The inside of Dutch's house smelled of the chili that had been on the stove since early morning, a smell of deep work spices and slow meat that moved through all the rooms. Dutch's 2 dogs, a brown lab named Corporal and an ancient wheezing beagle named Sergeant, moved between people with the contented purposefulness of animals that had learned that where people gathered, interesting things tended to fall off counters. Cole sat in the chair he always sat in when he was here, the one by the window, and Corporal immediately materialized next to him and put his head on Cole's knee with the calm entitlement of a dog who knew where he stood. The afternoon assembled itself out of ordinary parts. The chili required attention and received it. Dutch and Silas talked about a prospective chapter member, a former Army engineer named Cody, who had come to 3 chapter meetings and whose technical knowledge and general character had impressed the men who had spent time with him. Knox had updates on the fabrication plant, a new contract that would require expanding the second shift, which meant hiring. 23 applications in the first week, Knox said. 23 people who need work. I told my plant manager we can probably absorb 12 of them by Q1. Any of them vets? Dutch asked. 4 that I know of so far. Probably more that didn't put it in the application. Knox turned his cup. I always ask in the interview. Some of them don't want it on paper. They've had employers look at that and decide they're a liability. They're lost, Dutch said. My gain, Knox said. Cole listened to this conversation with the attentiveness of a child who has learned that adult conversations are worth listening to not as entertainment, but as instruction, as the transmission of a way of being in the world that cannot be taught directly, but can be absorbed over time through exposure. He had been absorbing this for his whole life, the particular ethos of men who built things and kept promises and hired people that other people would not hire and showed up on Fridays when 10-year-olds needed them to. Axel arrived at noon with a bag of cornbread from a bakery he liked in Nashville and set it on the counter without ceremony and poured himself a coffee and sat at the table, and the kitchen was full now and the chili was nearly ready. Dutch served it in bowls that were deep and heavy, ceramic bowls he had gotten at a market years ago, and the cornbread went in the center of the table on a wooden board and everyone ate. At some point during a pause in the conversation, Dutch looked at Cole. You all right, Dutch said, not the social inquiry version of the question, the actual question. Cole thought about it. Yeah, he said, I think so. What's going to happen Monday, Dutch said, when you go back? Cole looked at his bowl. He had thought about this. The return, the Monday version of the classroom, the social aftermath of what had occurred Friday. He had thought about Chase Dalton and Mrs. Gallagher and what the hierarchy of 5th grade at Ridgeline Academy would look like after the week had settled. I don't know exactly, Cole said, but I don't think it's going to be like before. Dutch nodded. No, it's not going to be like before. Chase didn't look at me when I left, Cole said. He looked at the ground. He'll regroup, Silas said from across the table. His father's voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind, just honest. Boys like Chase Dalton always do. His father will recalibrate and tell him something that makes yesterday make sense in a way that preserves the story they have about themselves. That's what people do. But he'll know, Cole said, even if he acts like it didn't happen. He'll know, Silas confirmed, and you'll know, and that's enough. Cole thought about that, the economy of it, not requiring that Chase Dalton be changed, not needing the public acknowledgement or the visible defeat, just the knowing. The private revision of what had been presented as fixed. That's enough, Cole said. The afternoon went on. After lunch, Knox and Weston went back to their bikes and the kitchen thinned to Silas and Dutch and Cole, which was the configuration Cole associated most with Dutch's house. Dutch took his coffee out to the back porch, and Cole followed, and they sat in the lawn chairs, while Silas talked to someone on the phone inside, and the backyard opened up before them into the 3 acres of Dutch's property. The grass going dormant, the tree line at the back turning gold corporal, investigating something of interest near the fence post. My grandmother had a saying, Dutch said. Shahnaman. He was looking at the tree line. She was from Georgia, raised my father and his 4 brothers on a farm outside Columbus. She used to say the only thing that matters at the end of any day is whether you showed up. Cole looked at him. Not whether you won, Dutch said. Not whether it came out right, just whether you were there. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I've thought about that a lot, in a lot of different contexts. He looked at Cole. Your dad showed us yesterday. 38 of us showed up. Because of you, because you mattered enough for us to be there. Cole felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes, the one he had been holding back intermittently since Thursday, and he let it sit there without fighting it. You know what your dad told me once, Dutch said. The year your mom died when you were 4. He said the only job I have now is making sure that kid knows what real looks like, knows what a man who keeps his promises looks like. Because if he knows that he can measure everything else against it, he'll never be fooled by the fake version. Cole was quiet. You're not fooled, Dutch said. Thursday in that classroom with all those kids laughing. You weren't fooled. You were hurt, but you knew. Dutch looked at him steadily. You always knew. The afternoon light moved across the yard. Corporal found whatever he was looking for near the fence and was satisfied. Inside the house, Silas's voice, low and even, moved through some business and came to rest. Cole looked at the tree line and thought about the Polaroid in his pocket, the same pocket it had been in all week through the classroom and the walk home and the night in the morning in the gymnasium. His father in the garage, the fluorescent light, the iron and leather. He thought about what Dutch had said. He always knew, and found it to be true precisely and completely. He knew what real looked like. His father had made sure of it. "Thanks, Dutch," Cole said. Dutch raised his coffee cup slightly. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just do the same for somebody else someday." They sat on the porch while the light changed and the afternoon moved toward evening. And eventually Silas came out and pulled up the third chair that leaned against the house wall. And the three of them sat and talked about nothing much and everything that mattered, the way people do when they have accumulated enough of a shared life to know that the specific words are secondary to the presence, to the fact of being here in this yard on a Saturday in October, with the dogs and the chili and the last of the good autumn light. It was full dark by the time they rode back. Cole held on in the dark, his arms around his father's jacket. The wind cold now, and direct the road a moving ribbon in the headlight. The sky over Tennessee was enormous and starred the kind of sky you could only see when you were moving fast through open country, when there were no buildings to interrupt it, and the horizon went all the way out. His father's jacket smelled of gasoline and worn leather, and the particular human smell of his father's skin, a smell Cole had known since before he could form a thought, a smell that was the olfactory equivalent of home, of safe, of constant. The engine note under them was steady and enormous and completely reliable. Monday would come, the classroom would be there and Chase Dalton would be there, and the hierarchy of fifth grade would be reassembling itself already, finding the new arrangement, the altered geometry that resulted from what had happened Friday. There would be things to navigate. There were always things to navigate. Cole understood this with the matter-of-fact clarity of a 10-year-old who had been paying attention. But he also understood what he carried: the Polaroid in his pocket, the jacket on his shoulders, the engine under him, the 38 men who had shown up on a Friday afternoon for no reason more complicated than the reason that they were supposed to. He was Cole Armstrong of Mercer Lane, Clarksville, Tennessee. His father built motorcycles and kept every promise he had ever made. His uncles had been to war and come back and built things and kept going. He had a club behind him that would ride 45 minutes on a workday for a 10-year-old who needed them. He was by every measure that actually counted exactly as his father had said. The richest kid in the room. The Dyna carried them home through the dark Tennessee night, the engine a constant below them, the stars above them vast and cold and bright, and Cole pressed his face against his father's jacket and felt the motion of the road and thought about Monday with something that was not quite fearlessness, but was in the same family. The settled assurance of a person who knows what they are standing on, who has tested the ground and found it solid. He would walk back into Ridgeline Academy on Monday morning. He would wear the denim jacket, the faded one, the one that had been his father's. He would have the Polaroid in his pocket. He would hold his head up, not because the room had changed, not because Chase Dalton would become something other than what he was, though something in the geometry between them had permanently shifted. He would hold his head up because he had always known what his father had built, and now he had seen it tested, and he knew it was real, and real things held. The lights of Clarksville appeared on the horizon, amber and growing, and the Dyna rolled forward through the dark toward them, steady and unbroken, carrying a father and his son home. Monday came with a sky the color of old pewter and a cold that had arrived definitively overnight, the kind of Tennessee cold that was no longer pretending autumn had not ended. Cole wore the denim jacket over his school shirt and felt the Polaroid in the pocket as he went down the stairs, its weight a constant that was also a kind of steadiness. His father was at the kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper, not reading it exactly, holding it in the way of a man who has set out an object of routine in the morning and then gotten distracted by his own thoughts. He looked up when Cole came down. "Ready," his father said. Cole poured himself a glass of orange juice. "Yeah." They did not say anything else about it. They did not need to. The weekend had said what needed saying. Dutch's porch, the ride back through the dark, the stars over the open country between Hartwell and Clarksville. Silas had given him everything he was going to give him, had laid it out with the same methodical care he applied to everything, And now the job was Cole's, and they both understood this, and neither of them needed to make it complicated. Cole drank his juice, picked up his backpack, and walked to school. The morning was cold, and the leaves were down in earnest now. The sidewalk wet with overnight rain, and carpeted along the edges with the matted down residue of fall, the good color mostly gone, the trees showing their structure. Cole walked with his hands in his pockets and his chin slightly down against the wind and thought about the shape of the day ahead. He had spent parts of the weekend in low-level anticipation of Monday, not dreading it, but tracking it the way you track weather, knowing it was coming and wanting to understand its shape before it arrived. He had thought about the classroom, about Mrs. Gallagher, about the specific social ecology of fifth grade at Ridgeline Academy, and the ways in which Friday's events might or might not have altered it. He had thought about Chase Dalton. Chase was not stupid. Cole had established this early on and had maintained the assessment across 2 years. Chase was actually one of the sharper people in the class. He read situations quickly, adapted his performance for different audiences, understood leverage and advantage in ways that required genuine intelligence to deploy consistently. What he lacked was not intelligence, but something else, something that had to do with whether you bent your understanding towards service of yourself or towards something that included other people in its accounting. Chase would not be embarrassed today, not visibly. He would have reassembled himself over the weekend with the assistance of whatever framing his father had provided, and he would come back to school with his account of Friday arranged in a way that preserved his dignity and his standing. This was fine. Cole was not coming back to defeat Chase. He was not coming back to claim anything specific. He was coming back because the classroom was where he went on Mondays, and he was done going, reluctantly done going with his head angled toward the ground as though that angle were the honest one. He turned onto Ashwood Lane. The Range Rovers and the charging Teslas and the morning parade of expensive drop-offs were already in progress. Cole walked past them with the same forward-facing attention he had always had, and if anything was different today, it was a quality of the attention itself. Something more settled in it, more authorized the attention of a person who had decided something and was now simply doing it. He went through the front gate. The first person he encountered that mattered was Fletcher at the lockers, who looked at him and then looked away, and then looked at him again with an expression that Cole read accurately as, "I am trying to figure out where you sit now, given everything that happened Friday, and I have not landed on an answer yet." Cole nodded at him. Fletcher nodded back. It was civil. It was different from any interaction they had previously had. Second period was English. Cole walked into Mrs. Gallagher's class and took a seat in the second row. Mrs. Gallagher was already at the board writing something in her precise, controlled handwriting. She paused when Cole came in, a brief pause, nearly imperceptible, and then continued writing. When she turned to face the class to begin the lesson, she looked at Cole first briefly directly with an expression that was too complex to read. In the fraction of a second she gave it, and then moved on to the room at large and began talking about the day's work. It was enough. Cole recognized it as the version of acknowledgement available to a teacher in a room full of students, communicating privately while performing publicly. He did not need more than that. Chase came in 2 minutes after the bell. He took his seat at the back without making eye contact with anyone in particular, arranged his materials, and fixed his attention on the front of the room with the practiced composure of someone who has decided that the best strategy is to treat the present situation as entirely normal. Cole did not look at him. For the first hour of the school day, this was the pattern. The room navigating around something that had happened without discussing it, the social geography rearranged but the new arrangement unnarrated. This was how fifth grade worked, how most social worlds worked. The thing that changed was the map, not the stated rules. Cole worked on his English assignment and paid attention to Mrs. Gallagher's lesson and did not perform any version of himself he did not mean. He was simply there in his second row seat, present in the way he had learned from watching his father be present. Without announcement, without performance, simply in the space and fully occupying it. At the lunch break, something happened that he had not anticipated. A girl named Masi, who sat in the front row and had spent 2 years being relatively invisible to Cole, in the specific way that quiet people are sometimes invisible to other quiet people, appeared beside him in the lunch line and said, "Your dad is actually really cool." Cole looked at her. "I mean," she said with the slight backtracking of someone checking whether they had said the thing correctly, what he said, about being brothers, About the guy who builds jobs and the guy who helps kids. She shrugged a small, controlled shrug. I thought it was real. It is real, Cole said. I know, she said. That's what I said. They got their lunch and went to their respective tables. But something had shifted again in the small, granular way that shifts happen in social worlds. Not a revolution, not a reclassification, just an adjustment of the angle at which one person regarded another, a revision of the initial read, a small but permanent correction. Other things happened that week in the incremental, undramatic way that the interior of social worlds change. A boy named Davis, who had always been broadly friendly, in the way of people who were not paying close attention to individual dynamics, sat near Cole at lunch on Tuesday and told him about a motorcycle his uncle had, and asked Cole questions about bikes with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Cole answered them. Davis came back Wednesday with more questions. On Thursday, Mrs. Gallagher handed back the career week projects. Cole's corkboard had his grade written on the back, A+, and below it, a sentence in red pen, outstanding honesty and genuine feeling. Well done. He folded the corkboard carefully and put it in his backpack. Chase received his project at the same time. Cole did not look at what grade was written on Chase's trifold board. He did not need to know. The projects were different things, had been different things from the beginning, and that was as it should be. Chase glanced over at Cole's corkboard. The glance was brief, unreadable, and quickly redirected. Cole put the board in his backpack and did not think about it further. The week ended. The next week began. Ridgeline Academy continued to be what it was, a school whose values were partly aspirational and partly a reflection of the ecosystem. It served a place where certain children had certain advantages and certain other children navigated the space those advantages created. Cole was still the kid from Mercer Lane. He still walked to school. The denim jacket was still too large for him. His sneakers were still scuffed. But the room had changed its reading of him, and he had changed his reading of the room. And these changes were not dramatic or announced, but were permanent. The way the things you have been through become permanent, becoming part of the structure by which you understand the rest. He was no longer trying to be invisible. That was the main change, and it was not small. He had never been trying to be visible in the way that some kids tried. Not performing, not competing, not deploying himself strategically in the social space. But he had been trying without quite articulating it to himself to be present in a way that did not draw attention, to take up the minimum amount of room, to pass through the day without providing anything that could be used against him. That was over. He did not need to announce himself. He did not need to campaign or compete. He just needed to be what he was, fully and without apology, and let the room make its adjustments around that reality. This was what his father had given him Friday afternoon. Not protection. The 38 men were gone, were back in their lives, in their garages, in their shops, and they were not coming back to handle whatever Monday presented. What his father had given him was the visible proof of something he had always carried implicitly, the proof that what stood behind him was real, that the structure he lived inside was genuine and tested and solid. You could not take that away from a person. You could laugh at a Polaroid in a classroom. You could deploy the social weapons of wealth and status and the comfortable cruelty of children who had been told by their circumstances that they were winning, and none of it touched what Cole carried, because what he carried was not dependent on anyone else's assessment of it. It was real. It was his. It was enough. 2 weeks after the open house, Cole was in the garage with his father on a Saturday afternoon when a car turned onto Mercer Lane and slowed and pulled up in front of the chain-link gate. It was a Honda sedan, 10 or 12 years old, practical and unremarkable. The driver was a woman Cole did not recognize at first. Dark coat, gray hair, pulled back, sitting in the driver's seat, looking at the house with an expression Cole could not read from the driveway. His father wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the gate and looked at the car. The driver's door opened and Mrs. Ruby Gallagher stepped out. Cole stopped moving. She was not in her school clothes. She was wearing jeans and a dark coat and boots with mud still on them from wherever she had been before, and she looked, without the school setting around her, slightly smaller than he remembered, slightly more approximate, the way all people do when you remove them from the context in which you have always seen them. She saw Silas at the gate. She held her handbag with both hands in front of her, which was the body language of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, but was not confident it would come out right. "Mr. Armstrong," she said. "I'm sorry to come without calling. I should have called." Silas opened the gate. "Come in, Mrs. Gallagher." She came through the gate and stopped when she saw Cole standing in the garage doorway with a chrome piece in his hand. "Cole," she said. "Mrs. Gallagher." There was a moment that had a specific quality to it, the quality of a moment that is carrying more than its surface. Three people in a driveway in November, with the weight of what had happened between them unaddressed and needing addressing. She looked at Silas. "I came because I wanted to say something that I should have said a long time ago, possibly 2 years ago, but certainly after last Thursday." She took a breath. "I did not handle it well. When Chase was laughing and the class was laughing, I told them to settle down. I said it was a nice hobby. Those were the wrong words, and I knew they were wrong when I said them, and I did not correct them." She looked at Cole. Her voice was steady, but the effort required to keep it steady was in the careful control of her face and the grip on her handbag. "I owe you an apology," she said, "a real one, not the professional version. You stood up in front of that class and told the truth about your family. That took real courage, particularly in that room. And I protected myself instead of protecting you. I'm sorry." Cole looked at her. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to come to Mercer Lane on a Saturday with muddy boots and no professional armor. "Okay," Cole said. She looked at him as though she had expected more resistance, more to push against, and his simple acceptance of it left her with the surplus of the prepared speech. "I also wanted to tell you," she said, "that what your father said in that gymnasium, what those men did, it's been in my head every day since. I've been a teacher for 22 years. I've never had a parent come to an open house and do what your father did." She looked at Silas. "Not the arrival, the speech, what you said about your brothers, about what the club actually is." She shook her head slightly. "I've been doing this wrong in some ways. I've been teaching to the room instead of for every student in it." Silas looked at her steadily. His expression was not warm exactly, but it was not closed either. The expression of a man who was listening without having decided yet whether what he was hearing was what it appeared to be. "That's a hard thing to admit," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." There was a pause. "You want coffee?" Silas said. She blinked. Yes, actually. That would be good." They went inside. Cole set the chrome piece on the workbench and wiped his hands and followed. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and there was a plate of the cookies that his father made on Saturday mornings, the thick oatmeal ones with raisins that were one of the consistent comforts of Cole's domestic life. His father poured 3 cups and set them on the table, and they sat. Mrs. Gallagher asked about Cole's project, what grade he was giving himself for the week, a question that was both genuine and a teacher's instinct. Cole thought about it. "A solid B," he said. "I got scared on Thursday. I went quiet when they started laughing. I should have kept going." She looked at him carefully. "And what would you have said?" "I would have said what my dad said. About Dutch. About Knox. About Axel." He looked at his coffee cup. "I knew all of that. I could have said it. I just got scared and went quiet." "You were 10, she said. "I'm still 10, he said. She smiled at this, a genuine smile, not the managed professional kind. "Yes, you are." She turned the cup. "For what it's worth, the paragraph you wrote, he is the best person I know. That is a complete and precise piece of writing. Everything necessary is in it, nothing extra." Cole looked at her. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it complete." His father was quiet during most of this listening in the way he listened to things that involved Cole, present, attentive, not interfering with the interaction, but available to it the way a well-placed load-bearing structure is present without being visible, doing its work without announcing itself. Mrs. Gallagher finished her coffee and stood. She thanked them both. At the door, she paused and looked at Cole. "There's a young writers group that meets after school on Wednesdays," she said. "In the library. They're a good group, kids who take language seriously." She said it without pressure as an offering, and the offering was genuine. "If you're ever interested." Cole thought about it. "Maybe," he said. She nodded. "Maybe is enough." She pulled on her coat. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Armstrong." "Gallagher," his father said. She paused. He looked at her with the direct, leveled regard that communicated he was saying something he had decided to say. "My son is going to do fine, whatever classroom he's in." He paused. "But it matters that you came." She absorbed this, nodded once definitively. "Yes," she said, "I know." She went out to the Honda and backed down Mercer Lane and turned onto Ashwood and was gone. Cole and his father stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. The garage was still open, the afternoon still available. The chrome piece on the workbench still waiting. She drove here on a Saturday, Cole said. Yes, she did, his father said. Is that what happens when people do the wrong thing and then realize it? Silas looked at his son. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. He reached for his coffee. The ones who make the trip are worth something. Remember that. Cole thought about that. The ones who make the trip. The distinction between the people who acknowledge privately and the people who showed up in person in the actual physical space to do the thing that needed doing. His father had made the trip on Friday with 37 others behind him. Mrs. Gallagher had made the trip on Saturday with muddy boots and a prepared speech. Different scales, different stakes, the same fundamental willingness to put yourself in the room where the acknowledgement needed to happen. He nodded. I'll remember, he said. They went back to the garage. Cole picked up the chrome piece and worked on it with the careful attention his father had taught him, the movement of the rag slow and consistent working the metal until the surface gave back what it had. His father was at the engine stand back in the patient, ongoing work of the Sportster, and the garage was warm from the afternoon sun coming through the high windows, and outside Mercer Lane was quiet in the Saturday way, the ordinary stillness of a neighborhood doing its ordinary things. The Polaroid was in his jacket pocket. It always would be. He understood now at 10 what it took most people years to understand, or what some people never understood at all, that what you came from was not a limitation, unless you let it be that the things you were given, the jacket, the garage, the 38 men who showed up, were the actual inheritance, the real kind, the kind that could not be assessed or depreciated or lost in a market correction. He came from Mercer Lane. He came from a man who fixed engines and kept every promise he had ever made. He came from brothers who drove 45 minutes because that was what brothers did. He came from a tradition of showing up. He carried all of that in the Polaroid and in the jacket and in the way he held his head when he walked into Ridgeline Academy, and no one in that building, not Chase Dalton, not Gregory Dalton, not the board of trustees or the brass plate on the library wing, could tell him it was not enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The Polaroid stayed in his jacket pocket all the way through 5th grade and into 6th grade and beyond, and it continued to be warm from being carried, and he continued to find it with his thumb in his pocket during the moments when he needed the reminder, though. He needed the reminder less and less as the years went by. And the thing it pointed to became not just a fact about his father, but a property of himself, something he had absorbed so thoroughly it no longer needed the external reference. His father was still in the garage on Mercer Lane when Cole came home from school. The engine was still turning and the fluorescent light was still overhead, and the socket wrench was still moving over the work with the patient, unhurried certainty of a man doing what he was built to do. Cole dropped his backpack by the back door and went into the garage. How'd it go? His father said. Cole picked up a rag from the workbench and started cleaning a chrome piece that was waiting to be inspected. It was the kind of work you could do while thinking the kind that occupied your hands and left your mind room to move. Fine, Cole said. It went fine. His father nodded. The engine block was on the stand, and the work was half done, and the afternoon was long yet, and they worked together in the garage in the comfortable, productive silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were now getting on with it. Outside, the November sky was low, and the wind was picking up along Mercer Lane. The sound of it moved through the gaps in the garage walls and was absorbed by the smell of motor oil and the steady, reliable note of work being done. And in the garage on that block, in that city, in that state, a man and his son were exactly where they were supposed to be doing what they were supposed to do. The structure of their life, holding under the weight of everything that had tried it, exactly as it was built to do. The weeks following the open house had a different texture to them, the way air feels different after a storm is broken. Cleaner, more settled the pressure that had been building released. Cole moved through the school days with the changed orientation of someone who has been relieved of a weight he had been carrying so long he had stopped knowing it was there. He started going to the writers' group on Wednesdays. He had not planned to. He had said maybe to Mrs. Gallagher, which was not a yes and was not a commitment. And for 2 weeks after she had offered, he had walked past the library on Wednesday afternoons and kept walking the way you keep walking past things that interest you when you have not yet decided how much you want to let them matter. Then on the 3rd Wednesday, he stopped walking and went in. The group had 5 members: a girl named Rosa, who wrote stories about her grandmother; a boy named Tate, who was working on something he called a manifesto, which turned out to be a collection of observations about his neighborhood that were more precise and more funny than anything Cole had encountered in his English classes. Two sixth graders he did not know whose names were Sam and Petra, and a seventh grader named Denny who wrote poetry that was strange and sometimes very good. They met in the back corner of the library at a round table under a window that looked out over the school's rear courtyard. Mrs. Gallagher facilitated, which mostly meant she asked questions and occasionally redirected, and the actual work was done by the students reading things they had written and the others responding with the specific kind of attention that writers pay to other writers' work, which is different from ordinary attention because it is aware of choices, aware that each word is the result of a decision even when the writer was not consciously aware of making one. Cole brought the paragraph he had written for the corkboard on his first day. He read it out loud and then looked at the table. Rosa said, "The last sentence is the whole thing. Everything else is build up, and the last sentence is the point." Tate said, "The rhythm is good. He is a motorcycle mechanic and restorer. The three syllables of restorer at the end land hard. You hear it." Denny said, "It sounds like you meant it." Cole looked at them. "I did," he said. "That's the only way it works," Denny said. He was 14 and had the slightly detached quality of someone who had already figured out something most people took years longer to figure out. You can't write something true without meaning it. The meaning is in the language. It's not separate. Cole thought about this for a long time after the meeting, walking home through the November afternoon, the cold air on his face and the Polaroid in his pocket and the sound of the group's voices still present in his head, the particular pleasure of having said a thing accurately and having someone else recognize that it was accurate. He thought about what his father did with engines, the attention he brought to them, the patience, the insistence on doing the work right, not because anyone was watching, but because it was true that the work had to be right. He thought about how that was the same thing, exactly the same thing as what Denny had said about writing. The meaning is in the language. It's not separate. He started writing things down, not in the formal sense, not with any goal or audience in mind, but in the way you do when you have discovered that words are tools and you are beginning to learn how they work, reaching for them and testing them the way his father tested joints before he trusted them with load. He wrote in the composition notebooks he had always used for schoolwork in the margins, and on the back pages, small precise observations about the things he saw and the things he thought not trying to be impressive, trying to be accurate. He wrote about the garage, about the specific weight of a socket wrench in the hand and what it felt like to place it on a bolt and feel the metal connect with metal, the mechanical certainty of it. He wrote about the sound of the Dina idling in the morning, the way it was different from the sound of other engines, the way you could identify an engine by sound, the way you could identify a person by their footstep if you had known them long enough. He wrote about Dutch's ramp, the specific dimensions of it, the angle of incline, the way the handrails were set at, the height Dutch needed, and in writing about it understood for the first time the full weight of what it represented, which was not just a practical accommodation, but a statement in wood and concrete and paint that said, you belong here, this place is made for you. You are not a problem to be worked around, but a person to be built for. He wrote about the gymnasium, about the sound of the engines arriving, the way it moved through the floor first and then through the air, the way it had changed the room before anyone could see what was causing it. He wrote about his father's face when he knelt on the floor of the gymnasium and put both hands on Cole's shoulders, the lines around his eyes, the absolute directness of the attention, a man who was for that moment entirely present, entirely there, giving everything he had to the task of making sure his son knew what was true. He filled half a composition notebook in 3 weeks. Mrs. Gallagher read some of it with his permission at the following week's writers' group meeting. She did not read it out loud. She read it to herself, sitting at the round table with the rest of the group present and working on their own things, and when she was done, she closed the notebook and put it on the table and looked at Cole for a moment. "You should keep doing this," she said. "I am," Cole said. "Good." That was all. It was enough. The December that followed was the first December Cole could remember that felt entirely adequate to itself. Not too long, not too pressured, not weighted down by the particular social anxieties that had made the previous Decembers at Ridgeline Academy feel like obstacle courses designed for people whose obstacles were different from his. The school had its events and its performances and its calculated displays of institutional generosity, and Cole moved through all of it with the easy competence of someone who has been relieved of the need to prove something. He went to the winter concert in the school gymnasium, the same gymnasium where 38 motorcycles had arrived 6 weeks earlier, and sat in the folding chairs with the other families and watched the fifth-grade chorus perform 3 songs. And when Chase Dalton's section of the chorus came on, Chase looked at the audience in the way performers look at audiences, scanning, assessing, finding the familiar faces. And when his eyes passed over Cole, his expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change, because the expression that had been there before that particular calculating assessment was simply gone. It had been replaced by the absence of a particular expression, which was its own information. Cole watched the concert and thought about the composition notebook in his backpack, and the writers group on Wednesday, and the paragraph he was working on that tried to describe the quality of light in his father's garage in the early morning. The specific angle of it, through the high windows, the way it caught the dust that was always in the air of the garage, the particles made visible in it, like stars in a small domestic sky. He was working on the sentence that would make it true. He would find it. He had learned enough by then to know that the right sentence was always there to be found if you were patient enough and precise enough and honest enough about what you were actually looking at. His father had taught him that, though not about sentences, he had taught him that about engines. Some things were true about all the work a person could do regardless of what the work was. You brought your whole attention to it. You were patient. You did not rush it. You did not cut corners. You treated it right because it mattered, not because anyone was watching. Cole walked home from the concert through the December dark with his father riding slowly alongside on the dyna, the engine idling in the cold air, the headlight making a yellow cone on the wet pavement ahead of them. The holiday lights were up on the houses along Ashwood Lane, red and green and white, the colors blurring slightly in the light rain that had started falling. "Good concert," his father said. "It was fine," Cole said. "Chorus was in tune, more or less." His father rode alongside in silence for a moment, the engine note steady in the cold. "You working on something?" his father said. He had seen the composition notebooks. He had not asked about them. His father was good at knowing what to ask and what to leave alone. "Yeah," Cole said. "A paragraph about the garage, the morning light." His father was quiet for a moment. "Let me know when you've got it right," he said. Cole looked at him in the dark, the shape of him on the dyna, the patch barely visible on the back of the cut. In the poor light, the word Tennessee was invisible at this distance. "I will," Cole said. They turned onto Mercer Lane, the lights of home visible ahead of them, and the rain came down softly on the street, and the engine idled alongside Cole's footsteps. And the composition notebook was in his backpack, and the Polaroid was in his pocket, and the sentence he was looking for was somewhere just ahead of him, waiting to be found.